Can I say to all of you ladies and gentlemen, most particularly Paul McClintock and Stephen Martin and the directors of CEDA, a body that I first made contact with when I became a junior minister in the Fraser government late in 1975. It's a huge pleasure to be here tonight. But ladies and gentlemen, what I want to do tonight is not, perhaps as the title suggests, just to go through a litany of all of the economic changes that I think are desirable, but I will certainly come to that in part. But I want to try and put into context the broader challenge of economic reform in this country. And economic reform is not just a function of deciding what has to be changed to make the economy more productive and more competitive, because that is the simple goal and the simple objective. You reform not for the sake of reform, you reform to produce a more productive, a more wealth-laden society and a better society for our citizens. And in order to achieve those reforms, we have to have an understanding not only of the economic context, but we also have to have an understanding of the political context. And I think sometimes in the debates we have about the desirability of economic reform, there's sort of two parallel but quite separate debates going on. There's the debate in the business community and in academia and elsewhere and in organisations such as CEDA about what is desirable. And then there's almost a belief that once that's been decided and put on the table, then one way or another, the political process is going to take care of the reform. Now that is increasingly becoming apparent that is not working. And one of the reasons for that is that the political atmosphere of this country, along with the atmosphere of politics around the Western world, has changed enormously over the last 20 or 30 years. And I don't mean that we now have a coalition government. We once had a Labor government, and before that we had a coalition government. Before that again, we had a Labor government. The whole infrastructure of politics has changed an enormous amount. And unless we have, all of us as a community, an understanding of some of those changes, we won't necessarily reach the right conclusions about how we go about implementing economic change. And one of the things that I want to say at the outset is that much and all as we would wish it were otherwise, bipartisanship, and by that I mean agreement between the Coalition and the Labor Party in Australia on major economic issues has been fairly rare. There was a period in the 1980s when the Labor Party was in power, and to his credit, as Prime Minister Bob Hawke introduced, along with the support of his then Treasurer Paul Keating, a number of very significant and long-lasting economic reforms. Most, but not all of those reforms were supported by the then coalition. I remember, for example, the very day that Paul Keating announced that the Australian dollar would float, in my view, the most profound economic policy change in my lifetime, because what the floating of the dollar did was to open up the Australian economy in a way it had not previously been opened up to the world economy. It wasn't the hardest economic reform of that long period of economic reform to introduce. The harder one, I have to say, was the GST, because the GST affected everybody's lifestyle. I mean, the value of the dollar changed before the float, but instead of the change being implemented by the market, it was implemented by government fiat, which of course came to be seen as a wholly imperfect way of regulating our exchange rate. Now, I was able to say on that occasion when it was announced, when interviewed that evening, I said on behalf of the coalition in opposition that the government had taken a correct and courageous decision. And so it was that we were able to support a number of major changes, including, I think, the most courageous economic change of all that the Labor government introduced was to reduce tariffs. That was a tough call for a party that had its whole political base in the trade union movement. but we saw the wisdom of that and we gave them support. Now, I have to say that that sort of thing was not really to be repeated after 1996, when my government won office, and having said some kind things about my Labor opponents, I now have to remind the audience that when we got into office in 1996, the bipartisanship that we extended when we were in opposition was not to be repeated, and all of our changes, including, of course, the massive change in the tax system, were opposed tooth and nail. But I think the other thing that we have to understand about the political atmosphere, as well as the rarity of bipartisanship, is one other very significant thing that I do think is overlooked in a lot of the discussion about the behaviour of the Senate at the present time. I have to say that both Tony Abbott as Prime Minister and potentially Malcolm Turnbull also as Prime Minister had a harder time, or will in Malcolm's case have a harder time with the Senate than I had, because the principal crossbench party when I became Prime Minister in 1996 were the Australian Democrats. And the Australian Democrats were, although not from my point of view, the perfect crossbench party to deal with when it came to economic reform. They were damn sight easier to deal with than the Australian Greens. And I think this is important. I think it's overlooked. If you address the political spectrum in Australia, you have to locate the Greens to the left of the Labor Party, whereas you place the Australian Democrats between the Coalition and the Labor Party, certainly closer to the Labor Party than to the Coalition. But the significance of that was that in 1996, Peter Reith was able to negotiate through our workplace relations changes with Cheryl Kernot, the then leader of the Australian Democrats. And again, historically, of much greater importance still, we were able to negotiate with the Australian Democrats 80% of the goods and services tax package that we had taken to the 1998 election. Now, I think it's important to bear this in mind when we look at the context of the difficulties that any government has to have in dealing with an upper house which it doesn't control. And one of the other things that's even more important to understand about the politics of Australia in 2015 is that it is a lot less tribal than it used to be. The rusted-on support for the Coalition now is weaker than it was when I first got involved in politics in the late 1950s and into the 60s. And the same can be said, as those in this room more familiar with the Labor side of politics will know, the rusted-on support for the Labor Party is a lot less than it was. When I was first getting involved in politics, I used to think there was a 40-40-20 rule, and that had nothing whatever to do with taxation entitlements for insurance companies or life officers, but it had everything to do with the fact that 40% of the population always voted Labor, 40% always voted for us, and 20% sloshed around in the middle. I now think, when I watch the volatility of Australian politics, and if you think Australian politics is not volatile, think of what happened in Queensland in the last state election compared with the previous one. Think of the volatility that occurred in Victoria. We used to think that every government was guaranteed at least a second term. That's not the case. I now think it's something like a 30-30-40 rule. You only have 30% who always vote for us and 30% for the others, and the others move around. Let me just leave you with one other statistic, and that is that in 1966, now why do I choose 1966? Many of you in this room weren't alive in 1966, but those of you who were and who remember it, that was the election when Harold Holt defeated Arthur Caldwell. And at that particular election, it actually recorded the highest two-party preferred vote for either side of politics since the end of World War II. And on that occasion, the Labor Party, although it was defeated, still secured 40% of the primary vote, whereas in 2013, when Tony Abbott defeated Kevin Rudd, it only got 33% of the primary vote. Now, all of that suggests that on both sides there's been a disaggregation, a falling away. And why is that relevant? It's relevant because it reflects itself in the composition of the Senate. The Senate has a voting system called proportional representation, which directly reflects, more so than in the House of Representatives, those proportions of the population that vote in a particular direction. So I think it's very, very important to bear that in mind, and it's also very important when many of you, as I'm sure you've done and will continue to do, get frustrated about the fact that a party polling only 0.3% of the vote can have somebody elected to the Senate, and you can have a preference whisperer going around and gathering up all of these second preferences, that you say, well, what's the solution to this? The solution to this is to change the voting system in the Senate. Now, I'm not against changing the voting system in the Senate, but it's got to be borne in mind that if you do change the voting system in the Senate, be careful of what you wish for. Be very careful, because if you change the voting system in the Senate to completely eliminate the micro-parties, what you are likely to do is to increase the likelihood of a larger number of members of the Australian Greens being elected. Now, many of you in this room may think that's a good idea, and I respect that. I don't actually, because I think the Australian Greens are an enemy of economic reform. There may be some causes that appeal to you in the Australian Greens, but economic reform is not the long suit of the Australian Greens, even though their new leader appears to me to be a far more reasonable and certainly a very articulate man. The other thing that I should remind you of is that political parties these days, the membership of political parties is a lot less representative of the generality of the community that vote for them. Political party memberships are lower than they used to be, despite the fact they deny it, and this applies to both of the major parties. There's a lot more factionalism in political parties now, and that's once again not just the Labor Party. There's plenty of factionalism in the Liberal Party, and it has undesirable consequences, as it does in the Labor Party. And this is not confined to Australia. One of the phenomena of modern politics is that the membership gets pushed to the extremes. You get, for example, in the United States, you get the Tea Party. I mean, as many of you would expect, I am broadly sympathetic in the American context with the Republican Party, not always, but broadly. But some of them are far too extreme for me, and I was accused of being occasionally a bit conservative, occasionally. And the same thing applies to the Democrats. I notice in this primary contest, and it's not much of a contest for the Democrats, I think Hillary will win. She'll win the primary. Different matter about the big one. But you've got a man called Sanders, and he is running as a self-styled democratic socialist. Now, I can't think that any of his illustrious, hoped-for predecessors as a Democratic candidate, Roosevelt, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Carter or Clinton, would ever have called themselves a democratic socialist. And then, of course, if you really want a spectacular example of how the membership of a political party can produce a result which is out of whack with the expectations of those who might vote for that party, you go across the Atlantic to London and you meet Mr. Jeremy Corbyn, who is an extraordinary exemplar of just how crazy the political process has become. I mean, this man has no hope of winning. He does not represent the generality of people who might not only continue to vote Labor in Britain, but hopefully come over to vote Labor in Britain. And, he spends much of his time deriding the most successful Labor Party leader Britain has had in 100 years, namely Tony Blair. At least Tony Blair won 3 elections, which has escaped, and I think that will escape Mr. Corbyn's grasp. Now, why do I do this? I mention it because it tells us that the behaviour of political parties now is less predictable, and the atmosphere is a great deal more fragmented than it used to be. And could I just, on a final note, because it often comes up in the context of this broad debate, that is, I hope that the party that I am still proud to belong to, and I had the privilege of leading for 16 years, never falls for the temptation of taking away from the parliamentary party the sole right to choose the parliamentary party leader. I think these mixed ways of choosing leaders are crazy. The principal responsibility in a Westminster system for a leader is to lead the members of Parliament. That occupies most, if not all, of the time of the person, the man or the woman who may fulfil that job. And can I just give you what I think is a retrospective piece of field evidence for that? The British Conservative Party has, over the years, had all sorts of ways of electing their leader. They once used to do it by a mysterious sort of almost ecclesiastical laying on hands process. The outgoing leader would go to Buckingham Palace and say, the chaps have met and we think you ought to call so-and-so to form a new government. And then they changed that to involve the parliamentary party, and they went through a period where the sole decision was made by the parliamentary party, and then they had this fused system where the party membership got involved as well. And it was during that time where the members of Parliament alone had the say that that extraordinary woman, Margaret Thatcher, emerged. And I just pose the retrospective question, where might British politics have been if they'd have had a different system? Because almost certainly, if you'd have involved the constituency branches and association, they would have voted to retain the then leader, Ted Heath, because there's always a natural built-in leadership amongst party members towards the man or woman who's there. So I mention all of those things to make the point that the atmosphere in which politics has developed in the Western world, and it's all around the world. It's what I say about Australia can be found in Britain, it can be found in New Zealand, it can be found in Canada, it can be found in the United States. And I think it's very important we understand that the environment is more complex. And as far as the Senate is concerned, it's also very important to remember that the basis of the reality now that the government in power rarely has control of the Senate is to be found very much in the introduction of the proportional representation system way back in 1949, and also the decision made in 1984 to increase the size of the Senate to 12 from each state. And interestingly enough, 12 divided by 2 gives you 6, and senators are elected for 6-year terms, and if you have an even number retiring every 3 years, which under the Constitution they have to, then it's very, very hard to get 4 out of 6. But previously, where the number of senators from each state was 10, you had 5 retiring every 3 years, and it's much easier to get 3 out of 5 than it is to get 4 out of 6. We fluked it in 2004 when we got 4 out of 6 in Queensland, but that was unexpected. And even though we had very solid majorities, it was very difficult. Now, I know that sounds a bit like a political science lecture, and perhaps it is. And perhaps that's not entirely what you expected to hear tonight, but I think it's important to understand that the political environment has not produced a continuity over the last 30 or 40 years. It's changed a great deal, and the whole political environment is more fragmented. There are far more single issues that determine how people vote. Both political parties have to grapple with this, and the old left-right divide that was fairly easily defined according to whether you more or less thought the government should intervene more heavily in the economy than not, and you had simplistically different views on some external relations issues. Those have gone. Now, having said all of that, the good news, the really good news about the cause of economic reform is that, in my opinion, nothing has altered the fact that Australians will vote and support economic reform if it satisfies two conditions. They have to be satisfied that the reform is in the interests of Australia. I found a fairly straightforward, endearing patriotism about most Australians, whether they voted for me or couldn't stand the sight of me when it came to economic reforms. If they thought it was good for the country, they would go along it. That was not to say they suspended self-interest. No, their patriotism didn't extend that far. They weren't going to suspend self-interest. But they were prepared to go along with it, provided it was in the interests of the country and provided also that it was fundamentally fair. Australians do pride themselves on the fair go, and it's real, it's live. One of the takeouts I had of 11 and a half years as Prime Minister was that Australians do believe in the fair go. And when they think something is unfair, they do react against it, no matter who it's coming from. So the good news is that I think Australians will support economic reform if the reforms are seen as good for Australia and they're also seen as fair. I think the other important thing to bear in mind when we're addressing economic reform is that the world economic environment now is a lot different from earlier periods of reform. I'm not saying that inflation won't return, but in many countries, deflation is now the challenge. Certainly the challenge in Japan. It is seen as the challenge in many countries in Europe. And there are signs that we are, at least for a period of time, in a new economic paradigm. We've had years and years of what is euphemistically called quantitative easing. It used to be known by the expression money printing. And you've had central banks, not in Australia, thankfully, but you have central banks around the world furiously printing money. The system is, in so many parts of the world, almost awash with liquidity. Yet there hasn't been the response to that I might have expected 20, 30 years ago or even 10 or 15 years ago. So I think there are signs that we are living in a new economic paradigm. There's no doubt that we are in the process of transitioning in Australia from a very heavy reliance on our resource industries to a more diversified economy. And that transition is essential. But, and there's a very emphatic and loud but, in the process we should not imagine that we are not, for years into the future, going to rely very heavily on our resource industries. And that our resource industries have certainly been the economic saviour of this country over the last 20 or 30 years. And I look back with almost disbelief on a World Economic Forum conference that was held in Melbourne on the eve of the Sydney Olympic Games. And the takeout from that conference, from the contributions of many people who were at that conference, was that Australia had a problem because it relied too heavily on old industries. And those old industries were mining and agriculture. And that was 2000, and we were berated and we were told that if we didn't develop new industries to replace these old industries, and in particular those industries, then we faced a very bleak economic future. So we've got to be certain, as a general observation about economic reform, we've got to be certain that in the process of transitioning and of reforming our economy, we don't do any gratuitous damage, and this applies particularly to policies related to climate change, that we don't do any gratuitous damage to our resource industries. The other exhortation I would make to our economic managers, and it's nice to be in a position to make exhortations to economic managers, having been in receipt of many exhortations over the years, is that we've got to keep a sense of balance about the economic challenges that we face. One of the reasons why Australia has been a successful country is that as a people and in relation to policy, we have always achieved a wonderful sense of balance. We have far more balance in our social policies, including education and health as well as welfare, than most European countries and the United States. Our welfare policies, often heavily attacked, are a lot better than many, including perhaps some in this room, would allow for. Speaking generally, they are not as harsh as the welfare policies of the United States. I have enormous affection and admiration for the United States, but I think their social welfare policies in some areas are too harsh. Texas, a state I visit a great deal, has the same population as Australia, but it has a prison population of 100,000. Now, some of those inmates are there simply because out of desperation to survive. They've committed crimes. Not all of them, not a majority of them, but some of them. So our policies are not as harsh as the Americans, but they're not as paternalistic as the Europeans. I mean, I feel enormous, along with everybody else in the room, enormous compassion at the present time for the people of France, and I feel for President Hollande in the enormous challenge he faces, but doesn't stop me mentioning to you that at the last election, one of the campaign promises of his party was to reduce the increase in the retirement age, I think from 60 to 62. Now, the idea that a country such as France with a declining birth rate should actually be reducing or not thinking about further increasing the retirement age is absurdly unrealistic. And if you think that our social welfare policies are too indulgent, and I know many do, and in some areas they obviously are, let me just give you a statistic from a 2014 OECD survey that showed that the highest percentile of cash payments in Australia went to the lowest quintile, and that is 42%, and the lowest percentage of those cash transfers went to the highest quintile, which was only 4%, which indicated that our welfare system, by a broad international comparison, with all its faults, and it's got plenty, and it can be reformed and changed and made less expensive and better, was still, by a world comparison, essentially lean, but certainly not mean. Having said that, Australia does have a spending problem. And I wouldn't want anybody in this room to think that the biggest challenge we have on the budget front is still the level of expenditure. While we can't be complacent about debt, although we are still below the OECD average when it comes to a debt to GDP, we've fallen quite a bit in the last 3 years. We've slipped behind in the last 3 years on that comparison. Now, some of that is due to the fact that other countries slipped earlier and we're sort of catching up with some of the slippage, but it's still a cause of concern. I notice, it's hard not to notice, that a community debate on taxation reform is now underway. These debates take a long way to work their way through. Now, I'm not suggesting that this debate is going to take as long as the debate on the GST took. The GST was first recommended in the Asprey report on taxation reform that was handed down in 1975. And what that report essentially said was that we should have a broad-based indirect tax and we should have lower personal income tax. It took 25 years before that was implemented. I don't think it'll take 25 years. I don't think it'll take 25 months. I won't go any lower than that in suggesting when the next round of tax reform will come in Australia. Now, tax reform should not become, as I think it was Angus Taylor, the Liberal member for Hume, observed, a lazy way of increasing revenue and an escape from taking difficult decisions on the expenditure front. Tax reform should be about improving the quality and fairness and effectiveness of the collection of revenue for the necessary services of government. There are a number of things that are fundamental to it. first and foremost, is that we still rely far too heavily in this country on personal taxation as a source of revenue collection. Our corporate tax rate does not compare well with the corporate tax rates of many of our competitors. It's too high. And the marginal tax rates are still far too high. The top rate in itself is high, but it cuts in also at a threshold which is lower than it is in many countries with which it is fair to make comparisons. So it's fundamental to any sensible tax reform that there must be a further shift in the mix between direct and indirect taxation. Something else about our personal taxation system, which has been, some might think, a hobby horse of mine, is that we should preserve both the horizontal equity of the personal taxation system as well as the vertical equity. I have long believed that the personal tax system should recognise that people who support people in addition to themselves should get some recognition in the tax system for that. And that's been a cornerstone of our taxation system for decades. It was my government that introduced the family tax benefit system. I did that very deliberately because I felt that the treatment of the families under the tax system had fallen behind. I don't regard family tax benefits as welfare payments. I regard them as tax breaks for the cost of having children. We know from our own experience that that additional cost commences from the day children are born, and increasingly it never ends. I think it is important that, therefore, we bear some of those things in mind. I think any reform of the indirect tax system, if it is to come about, must not produce an increase in the overall taxation burden. And it obviously, to be politically acceptable, and we were reminded by the Ipsos poll in the Financial Review and the Sydney Morning Herald this morning of just how sensitive the electorate is to any connection between personal income tax levels and changes to the indirect tax system. I think it's also important that we understand the role of the states in the process. All of the GST revenue now goes to the states. It's a pity that the original form of the GST in 1998 had not passed through the Senate, but that is now history, and that has to be addressed as part of any future. I applaud the fact that the government and the Prime Minister in particular have encouraged an open debate on this issue. You can actually debate these sorts of issues in Australia without the world coming apart and the roof falling in. And I do think it's a good idea, as the Prime Minister has said, that we don't get into the rule-in, rule-out game when it comes to taxation reform. There is just one other matter that I wanted to mention in the area of reform, and that, of course, is something of an obsession, perhaps some would call it an obsession, a lifelong policy interest of mine, and that is industrial relations reform. I do think that we have to return to this. We're deluding ourselves if we can persist years into the future with an industrial relations system whereby an organisational structure that now represents only 15% of the workforce still has an effective monopoly on the bargaining process. And this is of particular significance to small business. It's been off the agenda for the last few years because I think first and foremost the coalition was spooked from the outcome of the 2007 election about the unpalatable nature of any kind of industrial relations changes, and it dropped off our agenda. I think the fact that one of the products of the global financial downturn was a suppression of real wage growth, that real wages have remained flat, and that has been of benefit in the short term to the economy, although it's part of the new paradigm in which we're now living, that you can have this suppression of wages and yet not get some of the economic benefits of that might have been assumed 10 or 20 years ago. But I do think that we will need to return to industrial relations reform. And I guess the last word I would have to all of you about economic reform is, strangely enough, to borrow from a comment that was made by that wonderful person, Mother Teresa, when she was asked by somebody, how do you cope with all of these problems? And she said, oh, just one at a time. And when you think about it, there's a message in that for economic reformers. I think we should isolate those economic reforms that need to be focused on, and the ones that are most important, let's deal with them. And let's do them one at a time. It's pretty obvious to me that the economic reform people regard as the most important at the moment is taxation reform. And I hope that we can see a very willing debate on taxation reform against some of the principles that I've mentioned in the months and the years ahead. Australians will support change and taxation reform. They will support it if it can be demonstrated that it's in the public interest and it's fundamentally fair, and I'm optimistic that the conditions for that occurring are returning, and I certainly hope, adopting the principle of perhaps one at a time, we focus on that very heavily in the next few months and the next few years ahead. Thank you.